I think this was so dumb, so stupid by the US government. It's unbelievable. They basically terminated the dollar system. The US dollar's role as the major reserve currency is beginning to decline. The risk is that we could end up in a less free world and with administered economies, I would say.
In this highlight, hedge fund billionaire Felix Zulauf discusses the decade of roller coasters and how it will impact passive investors. Zulauf claims that in 2023, the old way of using basic investing strategies, such as the 60-40 portfolio, will no longer be effective. So, Zulauf says that if you want to be a successful investor, you need to pay more attention to the market so that you can predict the cycles. Later, Zulauf talks about how quickly the world is changing and how he thinks we can only grow if we reach a huge breaking point. If the change does not come peacefully in the form of new political leadership, it will come violently in the form of a revolution like we have not seen in the developed world. Make sure you stay until the end because Zulauf reveals the worst decision that the Biden administration has made so far. Let's hear what Zulauf has to say.
So this decade, I believe, is going to be a decade of roller coasters. And I call it the decade of the roller coasters. And I think these roller coasters are just about the opposite of what we have seen for passive investors in the last 10, 15 years. Passive investment in a steadily rising bull market is wonderful. That's the right way to do it. But in a roller coaster, passive investors with a 60-40 portfolio or whatever the mix is will end up with very poor returns and most likely with very poor real returns. So they will lose out. That means that investors have to train themselves to play the cycle. I do not mean short-term trading. I mean really selling when a bear cycle begins and buying when a bull cycle begins. And you can never hit the exact extreme, but somewhere nearby, you can probably do it as an experienced professional. And that's what we try to do for our subscribers. And so if they ride the bull cycles and just step to the side in the bear cycle, they will come out very well. If they are experienced and professional and they can even short during the bear cycle, they will do exceptionally well. So I think that's the new environment we are in. And it's all compounded by the new world we are in. You know, recently I looked at the map of the trading partners, the major trading partners of the US and China in this divided world. And in the year 2000, all the trading partners that traded more with the US were in blue color. And all those traded more with China were in red color. In the year 2000, red was China, North Korea, and a few other smaller countries. And the rest of the world was blue. When you look at today's map, you know, there is North America, NAFTA, Middle America, blue, the very western part of Europe, blue, and virtually the whole rest of the world is red. And we in the West have not understood yet that we live in a very different world. We think we are still as powerful and as influential as we were, and we try to dictate policies that the rest of the world thinks these are fools. We do not do that. That's not to our liking. And it backfires, and you see that particularly well in the case of Europe. The sanctions and boycotts against Russia is backfiring against Europe. And I feel that Europe, unfortunately, will step down to a lower league because of that. So it's a completely different world, and it's a world that is creating an economy that is like a war economy with scarcities. I recently had to buy a new washing machine in our place in the US, and the dealer told us it's 12 months waiting time, for international brands, and it's 6 months waiting time for domestic brands. And that's the new world, and this will not change. And even if China will restart, which occasionally they will, it is a divided world, and the supply chains will never be as it was. And the world will never be as globalized as it was. It will be deglobalizing, and it will become less efficient, and it will become more inflationary and more pricey. And therefore, the average Joe will lose out. He will be less prosperous and at the end of this decade. And therefore, it's important to make the best out of your money in this roller coaster decade.
Do you fear at all that there's going to be a breaking point at some point socially?
That is the normal way of development, basically. And when you study history, we are entering a period where there will be revolts. And if it goes peacefully, the revolt will be in elections, that they change governments. When the selections are not good enough, then there could be a new party. Maybe the US needs 3 parties or 4 parties or whatsoever. I don't know. But there will be changes. I do believe that at the end of this decade, our political system will be very different, and the people will vote against the current leadership and the nonsense policies they are pursuing. And that is in the whole democratic world. In some countries, it may get worse. It may be a real revolution. We have seen, we are used to revolutions in poorer countries. We have seen currency reforms in poorer countries, and it could very well be that later this decade, it could come to the industrialized democracies. Yeah.
And I'm curious, do you see that as ultimately being a change for the good, that, hey, we finally demand more sane policies? Or is there a concern, especially in the democracies and capitalist nations, the public just losing faith and beginning to sort of hear the siren song of more sort of socialistic policies of, hey, if I'm going to get kind of screwed by the system, I may as well vote for the guy who's promising me, free stuff along the way?
That is the big risk, and I cannot tell you. We will see as we go along during this decade. But the risk is that we could end up in a less free world and with administered economies, I would say. Administered economies means that the government decides much more than what it does today. And that
sounds very Soviet.
In the Soviet Union, we had 100% government economy. There was no private sector, so to speak. I think the private sector is constantly shrinking relative to the government sector. We see that going on everywhere, even in the US. In the US, we have jumped from the low 20% several years ago. We are now up to the upper 30% of government share of GDP. In the European Union, we are at 59%, so more than half. In France, we are at 64%. In China, we are at 35%, and I have been traveling to China when it was at 100%. They have gone in the other direction. So I think there are big changes coming, but I cannot tell you at the present time what direction it will go. My fear is that it will be more administered economies than free market economies in the future.
Okay.
10 years from now.
And as you talk about this divided world, and you gave that great example of looking at the map in terms of who traded with China and who traded more with the West or the US, I've got to imagine that the intensity of the red of the map over time must have really gotten catalyzed, and that's probably an understatement, after the Russian war in the Ukraine. right? Where, we sort of weaponized our financial system against Russia, and we basically forced the world more or less to kind of begin to determine who they want to trade more with.
That was the biggest blunder, and the Biden administration has made many blunders, but that was the biggest blunder by far, weaponizing the US dollar and the SWIFT payment system, because that taught the world that is not as close and friendly to the US as some others, that we should not hold our reserves in the US dollar. Therefore, the US dollar's role as the major reserve currency is beginning to decline. I think that China cannot store its reserves in US treasuries any longer. And I think they know that as well as I do. And therefore, I believe that in the current cycle, you will see that there will be a shift once the US dollar has stopped. And I think there is going to be another rally in the first quarter in the US dollar back to the highs, if not to higher highs, before it rolls over. That those countries will put their reserves into hard assets that they can store within their own national boundaries, and nobody can freeze those assets and things like that. I think this was so dumb, so stupid by the US government. It's unbelievable. They basically terminated the dollar system.
I highly recommend that you check out why Max Kaiser believes that the price of Bitcoin doesn't tell the whole story, and what factors make him incredibly optimistic of Bitcoin in 2023. Click this video now.